It's early 1945. Somewhere in western Germany, two American tanks roll forward through the ruins of a shattered town. Side by side, they advance, both painted in the same olive drab, both carrying white stars on their hulls, both crewed by men who fought their way across Europe. One is an M4 Sherman. It's been the face of American armor since 1942. Reliable, mass-produced, everywhere. The other is an M26 Pershing. It's new, powerful, and built specifically to kill the heaviest German tanks in a frontal fight. Here's the question. Which one won the war? The Sherman has the numbers tens of thousands rolling off assembly lines, equipping entire armored divisions present at every major campaign from North Africa to the Pacific. The Pershing has the firepower, a 90mm gun that can punch through a Panther's frontal armor at 1,000 yards, the kind of weapon American tank crews had been begging for since 1944. So which one was more effective? The tank that could win the duel, or the tank that showed up to every fight? This is the story of American tanks in World War II. It's a story told in two numbers: 88,410 total tanks produced, and 5 distinct designs that defined how America fought. By the end, we'll have a definitive ranking, but to get there, we need to go back to 1939, when the United States had almost no tanks at all and no idea how to use them. Arsenal of Democracy. The opening montage. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and kicked off World War II, the United States Army owned approximately 696 tanks, not 696 modern combat tanks, 696 tanks total, most of them obsolete M2 light tanks that were already a generation behind what the Germans were fielding. This wasn't just a numbers problem, it was a doctrinal crisis. The US military had no unified vision for how tanks should be used. Two competing philosophies battled for control. The infantry branch saw tanks as support weapons, slow, heavily armored vehicles that would crawl alongside foot soldiers, knocking out machine gun nests and reducing fortifications. They wanted what they called infantry tanks. The cavalry branch had a different idea. They envisioned fast, lightly armored combat cars that could perform traditional cavalry roles: reconnaissance, screening, and exploiting breakthroughs. Speed mattered more than armor. Neither branch was thinking about what the Germans were about to demonstrate in Poland and France: that tanks could be the primary offensive arm, concentrated in mass, supported by mechanized infantry and air power, breaking through enemy lines and encircling entire armies. The concept of blitzkrieg lightning war was still a foreign idea to American planners. The M2 light tank represented the state of American armor. It weighed about 10 tons, carried a 37mm gun, and had thin armor that could be penetrated by heavy machine guns. It was a training vehicle, nothing more. There was no heavy tank in American service. The medium tank concept existed only on paper with the M2 medium tank, of which a handful had been built, but never deployed. America was strategically and doctrinally unprepared for mechanized warfare. The tank infantry was a joke compared to Germany's panzer divisions, and worse, there was no infrastructure to change that quickly. The United States had never mass-produced armored vehicles. The automobile industry was geared toward civilian cars and trucks, not 30-ton war machines with cast armor and high-velocity guns. In 1939, if you'd asked military planners how America would fight the next war, tanks would barely have been part of the answer. That was about to change. France falls, America wakes. June 1940. In 6 weeks, German panzer divisions smashed through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The French army, considered one of the strongest in Europe, collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped at Dunkirk. By June 22nd, France had surrendered. The speed and totality of the German victory stunned the world. But in Washington, it did more than stun, it terrified. The fall of France invalidated every assumption American military planners had been working under. Ocean barriers weren't enough, static defenses didn't work, and most critically, the tank wasn't just a support weapon, it was the decisive arm of modern war. President Franklin Roosevelt saw the writing on the wall. On May 16, 1940, even before France fell, he addressed Congress and called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year. That number made headlines. But quietly, another monumental effort was being initiated, a parallel mobilization to produce tanks at an unprecedented scale. The challenge was immense. Building a tank wasn't like building a car. A Sherman would eventually weigh 33 tons and require precision-cast armor plate, complex welded hull construction, a powerful engine capable of moving that weight cross-country, a turret with hydraulic traverse, optical sights, radios, and a 75mm gun with a recoil mechanism that had to function reliably under combat stress. The U.S. government, through the War Production Board, turned to the auto manufacturers. Chrysler, General Motors, and Ford had mastered mass production for consumer goods. Now they would apply those techniques to war machines. But first, they had to build the factories. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant became the symbol of this transformation. Operated by Chrysler, it was built from scratch in just over a year and became the first facility in the world designed specifically for mass tank production. Other companies followed. Prest, Steel Car Company, and Pullman Standard began manufacturing Sherman tanks. General Motors divisions, particularly Cadillac, specialized in light tank production. Ford built engines. This wasn't just industrial retooling. It was a complete re-engineering of the American economy. Supply chains for steel, rubber, and rare metals were established. Tens of thousands of workers were trained. Machine tools were repurposed or built new. The entire civilian manufacturing base pivoted toward military production. By late 1941, when the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the groundwork was laid. America wasn't ready yet, but it was getting ready fast. The sleeping giant was waking up, and it was about to drown the Axis powers in steel. $88,410 reasons why America won. Let's talk numbers. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 88,410 tanks. To put that in perspective, Germany, over the same period, built around 46,857 tanks and assault guns. Japan managed about 2,515. The American total exceeded Germany and Japan combined. Only the Soviet Union, fighting a desperate war of survival on the Eastern Front, produced more armored vehicles than the United States. But the Soviets were building for one theater. America was equipping a global war, Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, and supplying its allies through Lend-Lease. Here's the breakdown by model. The M4 Sherman, 49,234 units. That's 55.7% of total production. More than half of all American tanks were Shermans. The M3 and M5 Stuart light tanks, 22,744 units, or 25.7%. The M3 Lee medium tank, 6,258 units, 7.1%. The M24 Chaffee light tank, 4,731 units, 5.4%. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, 2,212 units, 2.5%. Older M2 models and prototypes make up the rest. These numbers tell a story before we even look at the individual machines. The Sherman's dominance over half of all production reveals it was the centerpiece of American armored doctrine. The large Stuart production run shows the importance of light tanks, particularly in the Pacific. The tiny Pershing numbers, just 2.5%, hint at a tank that arrived too late to matter strategically. Now compare this to the enemy. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and around 1,800 Tigers across all variants. Formidable machines, certainly. But for every Panther Germany produced, the United States built 8 Shermans. For every Tiger, 27 Shermans. This production differential was itself a strategic weapon. It meant American forces could absorb losses and keep fighting. A damaged Sherman could be recovered by an M32 tank recovery vehicle and back in action within 24 hours. If it was destroyed, another was already on a ship from Detroit. German forces couldn't replace their losses. When a Panther broke down, and they broke down constantly, it was often abandoned. The sheer scale of American production allowed the US to do something no other nation could: fight simultaneously in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, while also supplying the British and Soviet armies. Thousands of Shermans and Stuarts went to Britain under Lend-Lease. Thousands more went to the USSR, where Soviet crews griped about the tall profiles but appreciated the reliability. This is the context for everything that follows. When we rank these tanks, we're not just judging individual combat performance, we're judging their contribution to a war effort that was fundamentally industrial. America didn't win because it built the best tanks. It won because it built enough good tanks to be everywhere at once. Five measures of war. Before we dive into the individual tanks, we need a framework. How do we measure effectiveness? What criteria separate a good tank from a great one, or a war winner from a failure? We'll use 5 categories. Firepower. Can the tank kill what it needs to kill? This isn't just about the caliber of the gun. It's about penetration at combat ranges, the effectiveness of high explosive shells against infantry and fortifications, and whether the gun is versatile enough to handle multiple roles. A tank that can only kill other tanks is less useful than one that can also support infantry. Mobility. Can the tank get where it needs to be? This includes top speed, but also cross-country performance, suspension quality, and reliability. A fast tank that breaks down constantly isn't mobile, it's a liability. Mobility also determines tactical flexibility. Can you flank? Can you exploit breakthroughs? Can you retreat if needed? Protection. Can the tank survive? Armor thickness matters, but so does armor slope, profile height, and internal layout. A tank with thick armor but a tall silhouette is an easier target. Protection also includes things like fire suppression systems and ammunition storage. A tank that brews up when penetrated isn't protecting its crew. Logistics and reliability. Can you keep it running? This is the category casual observers underestimate and veterans obsess over. A technically superior tank that spends half its time broken down is worth less than a mediocre tank that never breaks. Logistics includes ease of maintenance, parts availability, fuel consumption, and the ability to be repaired in the field. For the American war effort, this category was paramount. Strategic availability. Was it there when needed? Production numbers matter. A brilliant design that arrived in 1945 when the war is nearly over can't compete with a flawed design that was present for every major campaign since 1942. Availability also means adaptability. Could the tank be deployed in multiple theaters, or was it specialized for one environment? Here's the key tension we'll see repeated. Tactical excellence versus strategic impact. The tank that wins individual duels isn't always the tank that wins wars. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that's simply there, in overwhelming numbers, when you need it. Germany learned this the hard way. The Tiger and Panther were superior fighting machines in one-on-one combat, but they were mechanically unreliable, difficult to produce, and never available in sufficient numbers. Meanwhile, Shermans were everywhere. That presence, that ubiquity, was itself a form of effectiveness. As we go through each American tank, we'll score them in these 5 categories. By the end, a definitive ranking will emerge not based on which tank enthusiasts love most, but on which tanks actually contributed most to winning the war. The Scout, M3 and M5 Stuart. The Stuart light tank was America's first mass-produced armored vehicle of the war. Development began as an evolution of the pre-war M2 light tank, intending to create a fast, reliable scout vehicle that could be produced quickly. The M3 Stuart entered production in 1941, followed by the improved M5 variant in 1942. The M5 introduced some key changes. It replaced the M3's aircraft-derived radial engine with twin Cadillac Vate automobile engines. This made the tank quieter, more reliable, and easier to maintain. Parts were readily available from the civilian auto industry. The hull was redesigned for easier production. Mechanically, the M5 Stuart represented American pragmatism. Use what works, keep it simple, build it fast. Specifications. The Stuart carried a 37mm M6 gun as its main armament. Armor ranged from 12mm to 67mm at its thickest point on the gun mantlet. The twin Cadillac engines gave it a top speed of 36 miles per hour on roads. Combat weight was around 16.8 tons, crew of 4. Now let's break down effectiveness. Firepower. The 37mm gun was the Stuart's fatal flaw. By the time it saw major combat in North Africa in 1942, it was already obsolete. It could not penetrate the frontal armor of German Panzer III or Panzer IV tanks at standard combat ranges. The high-explosive shell was too small to be effective against anti-tank guns or entrenched infantry. Against light armor and exposed troops, it worked. Against anything else, Stuart's crews were outgunned. In the Pacific theater, however, where Japanese tanks like the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chi-Ha were much lighter, the 37mm was adequate. Mobility. This was where the Stuart excelled. It was fast, agile, and exceptionally reliable. The twin Cadillac engines in the M5 variant were quiet and rarely broke down. In reconnaissance roles, where speed and reliability mattered more than firepower, the Stuart was ideal. Its small size allowed it to maneuver in terrain where heavier tanks couldn't go, particularly in the dense jungles of the Pacific Islands. Protection. With a maximum of 67mm of armor, the Stuart was vulnerable to virtually every German anti-tank weapon. Even the 50mm gun on the Panzer III could penetrate it frontally. Its thin side and rear armor made it susceptible to heavy machine guns at close range. Crews knew they were in a tin can. The only advantage was its relatively low profile compared to taller medium tanks. Logistics and reliability. The Stuart was a masterpiece of reliability. Its automotive-derived components meant field maintenance was straightforward. Parts were interchangeable and readily available. It was light enough to be transported easily and could cross bridges that heavier tanks couldn't. This logistical simplicity kept Stuarts operational at high rates throughout the war. Strategic availability. 22,744 units were produced, a quarter of all American tank production. This ensured the Stuarts were present in every theater. However, their effectiveness was theater-dependent. In Europe, they were quickly relegated to reconnaissance after early combat losses. In the Pacific, they were frontline fighters. British tankers who first used the Stuart in North Africa gave it the nickname Honey, because it was a honey to drive. But that nickname carried a grim irony. It was pleasant to operate, but in combat against German armor, it was a death sentence. American crews in Europe learned the same lesson. The Stuart couldn't fight panzers. It could only scout, screen, and run. In the Pacific, the story was completely different. Japanese tanks were lightly armored and rarely used in large numbers. The Stuart's 37mm gun was more than sufficient to destroy them. Its multiple machine guns were devastating against Japanese infantry. During the island-hopping campaigns, Stuarts proved invaluable. Their small size was an asset in jungle terrain, and their reliability in tropical conditions was unmatched. The Stuart's legacy is split. In one war, Europe, it was obsolete by 1943. In another war, the Pacific, it was a war winner. This theater dependency is critical to understanding its effectiveness. The Stuart wasn't a bad tank. It was the right tank for the wrong enemy in Europe, and the perfect tank for the right enemy in the Pacific. Overall effectiveness. 6 out of 10. Highly theater-dependent, but crucial where it mattered. The Stopgap. M3 Lee and Grant. The M3 Lee was born of desperation. In 1940, the U.S. Army had no medium tank with a 75mm gun, a weapon deemed essential to counter German panzers. The design for the fully turreted M4 Sherman was still in development and not ready for production. The solution was a compromise. Take the chassis of the M2 medium tank, mount a 75mm gun in a limited traverse sponson on the right side of the hull, and place a 37mm gun in a small turret on top. It was clumsy and flawed, but it could be produced immediately. The British ordered it in large numbers and modified the design with a new, larger turret to accommodate a radio operator. They called their version the Grant, after Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The American version, with the original turret, was the Lee, named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Specifications. Main armament was a 75mm M2 or M3 gun mounted in the hull sponson, with a 37mm M5 or M6 gun in the turret. Armor ranged from 38 to 57mm. It used a Wright R9 75 Whirlwind radial engine. The top speed was 26 miles per hour on roads. Combat weight was approximately 30 tons. Crew of 7, an inefficient layout. Firepower. The 75mm gun was Lee's reason for existence. In 1942, it was a powerful weapon capable of defeating any German tank it faced, including the Panzer IV. The high-explosive shell was effective against infantry and fortifications. However, the sponson mount was a crippling flaw. The gun had very limited traverse, only about 30 degrees left and right. To aim at a target outside that arc, the entire tank had to turn. This made it slow to react and vulnerable in fast-moving engagements. The 37mm gun in the turret was largely useless by this point in the war. Mobility. The Lee used a reliable aircraft-derived radial engine, which was a point in its favor. But the suspension was primitive, offering a rough ride. The tank was not particularly fast or agile. Its tall profile over 10 feet high made it unstable on uneven ground and difficult to conceal. Protection. Frontal armor was reasonably thick for 1942, but it was flat and riveted. When struck by an enemy shell, the rivets could pop off and become lethal projectiles inside the crew compartment, killing or wounding the crew even if the shell didn't penetrate. The Lee's height was its greatest liability. It was impossible to find a hull-down position. The entire massive silhouette was always exposed. Logistics and reliability. Mechanically, the Lee was reliable. It shared many components with the later Sherman, which was a testament to the soundness of its powertrain. Maintenance was manageable. However, its design meant it had no future. Once the Sherman became available, the Lee was immediately phased out. Strategic availability. 6,258 units were produced during a relatively short production run from 1941 to 1942. This was enough to meet the desperate need for a gun-armed medium tank during a critical period. The M3 Grant made its combat debut with the British 8th Army in North Africa at the Battle of Gazala in May 1942. Despite its flaws, it came as a shock to Rommel's Afrika Korps. For the first time, the British had a tank that could outrange and destroy German panzers. The Grants were instrumental in holding the line, and later in the victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November of that year. In American hands, the Lee also performed adequately in the landings in North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942. On the Eastern Front, thousands of M3 tanks were sent to the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease. Soviet crews disliked the high profile it made the tank easy to spot and hit, but they valued the reliability of the gun and engine. The Lee was a deeply flawed tank, but it was arguably one of the most important of the war. It arrived on the battlefield at a critical moment when the Allies were outgunned and gave them a fighting chance until a superior replacement was ready. It bought time. In war, Sometimes that's the most valuable commodity. Overall effectiveness, 5 out of 10. A vital but temporary solution. The late bloomer, M24 Chaffee. By 1943, the limitations of the M3 and M5 Stuarts were painfully clear. The 37mm gun was useless against modern armor, and crews needed something better. The M24 Chaffee was the answer, a complete redesign of the American light tank concept. The primary requirements were to mount a more powerful gun and improve off-road performance without significantly increasing weight. The solution was to design a brand new light tank from the ground up. It incorporated a lightweight 75mm gun adapted from the B-25 Mitchell bomber and a modern torsion bar suspension system that provided a smoother ride and better cross-country. Mobility. Specifications. Main armament was the 75mm M6 gun. Armor ranged from 15 to 38mm. It used twin Cadillac Series 44-24 engines, the same reliable power plant as the M5 Stuart. The top speed was 35 miles per hour on roads. Combat weight was approximately 20 tons. Crew of 5. Firepower. The 75mm gun was a massive upgrade. It gave the Chaffee the same firepower as the original M4 Sherman, meaning it could engage medium tanks and was highly effective in the infantry support role. This transformed the light tank from a scout that had to run from a fight into a scout that could fight back. The gun's high-explosive shell was also far more effective than the Stuart's puny 37mm round. Mobility. The Chaffee was fast, agile, and had an excellent ride thanks to its torsion bar suspension. It was quiet and reliable, making it an exceptional reconnaissance vehicle. The new suspension also improved cross-country performance significantly compared to the Stuart. By far, it was the best light tank produced by any nation during the war in terms of mobility. Protection. To keep the weight down, the Chaffee's armor was extremely thin, no thicker than the Stuart's. Maximum armor was only 38mm. It offered protection only against small arms fire and shell fragments. Any anti-tank weapon could easily destroy it. This was the trade-off for maintaining speed and agility, logistics and reliability. The Chaffee continued the American tradition of mechanical excellence. Using the same reliable Cadillac engines as the M5 Stuart meant maintenance procedures were familiar and parts were readily available. The torsion bar suspension was more complex than the Stuart's, but still manageable in field conditions. Strategic availability. 4,731 Chafees were produced, but most arrived too late to see extensive combat. The first Chafees reached Europe in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Only about 1,100 made it to the European theatre before VE Day in May 1945. This late arrival severely limited its strategic impact. The crews who used the Chaffee loved it. It was quiet, fast, and packed a serious punch. Unlike the Stuart, a Chaffee crew could fight its way out of trouble if it encountered unexpected resistance. It was everything a light tank should be: a capable scout that could also stand and fight when necessary. But timing is everything in war. The Chaffee arrived when the war in Europe was nearly over. Its true potential was never fully realized in World War II. The tank that would have been invaluable in 1943 or 44 showed up in 1945, when the outcome was already decided. The Chaffee went on to serve with distinction in the Korean War, where it finally got the chance to prove itself. It remained in service with various nations for decades after, but in the context of World War II effectiveness, it's a story of what might have been. Overall effectiveness, 7 out of 10. An excellent design hampered by tragic timing. The Contender. M26 Pershing, the tank killer. The M26 Pershing was the tank American crews in Europe had been begging for since 1944. It was the direct result of the shock of encountering German Panther and Tiger tanks and realizing that the Sherman was fundamentally outgunned. For years, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and Armored Force Command had resisted developing a heavy tank. The prevailing doctrine was rigid and, in hindsight, flawed. Tanks should support infantry and exploit breakthroughs, the doctrine stated. Tank destroyers, lightly armored, highly mobile vehicles with powerful guns would handle enemy armor. This was the theory that dominated American armored thinking from the pre-war years through 1943. The problem was that reality on the ground didn't match the doctrine. Tanks encountered enemy tanks constantly. Tank destroyers were often unavailable when needed, deployed elsewhere, or simply not present in sufficient numbers. Sherman crews found themselves facing Panthers and Tigers with inadequate firepower. They adapted with tactics, flanking maneuvers, numerical superiority, hitting weak side and rear armor, but men died because of doctrinal stubbornness. Reports from the battlefield were unambiguous. Crews needed a tank with a bigger gun and heavier armor. Senior commanders like General Dwight Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley pushed for a heavier tank, but the Ordnance Department and Armored Force leadership resisted. They argued that the Sherman was sufficient, that tank destroyers would handle German armor, and that a heavy tank would be too slow and logistically burdensome. This resistance delayed the Pershing by at least 18 months. Development of what would become the 26 prototype began in earnest only in 1943, after the disastrous early encounters with Tigers in Tunisia and Sicily made the need undeniable. Even then, bureaucratic inertia slowed progress. It wasn't until late 1944, after the Normandy breakout revealed the full extent of the Panther threat, that the project was finally given top priority. Originally designated the 26, the design was a heavy, powerfully armed, and well-armored vehicle, built specifically to kill other tanks. It violated American doctrine, which is perhaps why it took so long to approve. In December 1944, it was finally redesignated as the M26 heavy tank and rushed to Europe as part of what was called the Zebra mission, a combat evaluation program to test the new design under real battlefield conditions. Specifications. Main armament was the 90mm M3 gun, one of the most powerful tank guns in service at the time. Armor ranged from 25mm at the thinnest points to 114mm of thick, well-sloped cast armor on the turret front and upper hull. It used a Ford GAF-Vate gasoline engine, essentially an upgraded version of the engine used in the Sherman. Top speed was 25 miles per hour on roads, though cross-country performance was hampered by the underpowered engine. Combat weight was approximately 46 tons. Crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Firepower. The 90mm M3 gun was a revelation for American tank crews. It was one of the best tank guns of the war, comparable in performance to the German Tiger's 88mm KWK-36. Against the Panther, it could penetrate the frontal hull armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against the turret, penetration was reliable at nearly all combat ranges. The Tiger one, with its flat armor, was vulnerable frontally at similar distances. With standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap ammunition, the 90mm could defeat most German armor at standard engagement ranges. With high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, a specialized tungsten core round that was always in short supply, the Pershing could even penetrate the frontal turret of the Tiger II, the most heavily armored tank in the German arsenal. The gun also had excellent high-explosive performance for engaging fortifications and infantry. For the first time, American crews had a weapon that didn't require them to choose between anti-tank capability and infantry support effectiveness. The 90mm did both jobs well. Mobility. This was the Pershing's Achilles heel. At 46 tons, it was significantly heavier than the 33-ton Sherman, but it used essentially the same engine, the Ford GAF, a Veit producing around 500 horsepower. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio of only about 11 horsepower per ton, compared to the Sherman's 15. The result was a tank that felt sluggish, acceleration was poor, top speed was adequate on roads but unimpressive. Cross-country performance suffered, especially on soft ground where the weight caused the tank to sink and bog down. The transmission, which was also derived from Sherman components, struggled under the strain. Early Pershings experienced transmission failures at higher rates than desired. The Continental-designed torsion bar suspension was modern and provided a decent ride, but the overall mobility package was compromised by the underpowered engine. Crews noted that the Pershing couldn't execute the kind of fast flanking maneuvers that Sherman's excelled at. It was a brawler, not a dancer. Protection. This is where the Pershing shined. The frontal armor was exceptional. The turret front featured 114 millimeters of cast armor at a steep slope, making it effectively much thicker due to the angle. The upper glacis plate was 102 millimeters of well-sloped, rolled, homogeneous armor. This level of protection made the Pershing largely immune to the German 75 millimeter gun mounted on the Panther and Panzer IV. Even the Tiger's 88 millimeter gun struggled against the Pershing's frontal armor at longer ranges. At close range, the Tiger could penetrate, but at typical combat distances of 500 to 1,000 yards, the Pershing could often withstand hits. The side armor was thinner, 76 millimeters on the upper hull, but still respectable. For American tank crews who had spent months in Shermans, knowing that any hit from a Panther or Tiger could be fatal, the Pershing's protection was psychologically transformative. They could finally fight without the certainty of being outmatched. Logistics and reliability. As a new and heavy design, the Pershing had teething problems. The underpowered engine and strained transmission led to mechanical failures. In extended operations, these reliability issues would have been significant. Maintenance was more complex than the Sherman, requiring more specialized tools and knowledge. Parts availability was also a problem. With only about 2,000 units produced, and most of those late in the war, spare parts were scarce. If a Pershing broke down, getting it repaired could take days or weeks, unlike a Sherman which could often be fixed within hours using readily available parts. Fuel consumption was higher than the Sherman due to the heavier weight and less efficient power-to-weight ratio. This added logistical burden in an army already stretched thin, supplying forces deep in Germany. Strategic availability. This is where the Pershing's story becomes tragic. Only 2,212 Pershings were produced in total, and the vast majority came off production lines in 1945. By the time production ramped up, the war in Europe was weeks from ending. The Zebra mission sent the first Pershings to Europe in January 1945. They were distributed in small numbers to select units for evaluation. The 3rd Armored Division received some. The 9th Armored Division received a few. Overall, only about 20 Pershings saw significant combat before VE Day in May 1945. 20 tanks out of an army of thousands. The strategic impact was negligible. The combat record of those 20 tanks, however, was impressive. The Pershing entered action in late February 1945 during the push into Germany. Almost immediately, it proved its worth. The most famous engagement occurred on March 6, 1945, in the streets of Cologne. A Pershing from Company F, 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, and was advancing through the rubble-strewn streets near the Cologne Cathedral when it encountered a German Panther at close range. The Panther had been lying in ambush and had just knocked out a Sherman. The Pershing's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, reacted instantly. The first shot from the 90mm gun struck the Panther's turret, penetrating and causing catastrophic damage. The Pershing fired 2 more times to ensure the kill. The entire engagement lasted seconds and was captured on film by an Army Signal Corps cameraman. The footage became one of the most iconic pieces of tank combat film from the war, clearly showing the Pershing's devastating firepower. At the Remagen bridgehead, where American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine in early March, Pershings were instrumental in holding the defensive perimeter against German counterattacks. Their heavy armor allowed them to absorb punishment while their guns destroyed German tanks and self-propelled guns attempting to eliminate the bridgehead. In the final drives across Germany in March and April, Pershings continued to perform well. Wherever they appeared, they gave American forces a decisive edge in tank versus tank combat. German crews who encountered them recognized immediately that the Americans finally had a tank that matched the Panther and Tiger. But the what-if haunts the Pershing's legacy. What if it had been available in June 1944 during the Normandy breakout? The battles in the Bocage, where Shermans struggled against well-positioned Panthers, might have been less costly. The advance through France might have been faster. What if it had been available in September and October 1944, during the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen Forest and around Aachen? American armor took devastating losses in that campaign, often against dug-in Panthers. Pershings might have turned those battles. What if it had been available in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge? When German Panther and Tiger spearheads punched through American lines in the Ardennes, Sherman crews fought desperately against superior armor. Pershings in those critical first days might have blunted the German offensive faster, saving thousands of lives, but it wasn't available for any of those battles. It arrived in February 1945, when Germany was collapsing, when the war had at most 3 months left, when the outcome was already decided. The Pershing was a masterpiece that arrived after the audience had gone home. The doctrinal stubbornness that delayed it was a failure of military leadership. The tank destroyer doctrine, while theoretically sound, proved inadequate in practice. Tanks needed to fight tanks, and they needed the tools to do so. The Pershing provided those tools, but 18 months too late. Crews who operated the Pershing universally praised it. After months of fighting in Shermans, where they knew they were outgunned and under-armored, the Pershing gave them confidence. They could finally engage German heavy tanks frontally without elaborate tactics or accepting heavy losses. The psychological impact of that confidence is difficult to quantify but undeniably important. The Pershing went on to serve in Korea, where it proved effective against North Korean and Chinese forces. It evolved into the M46, M47, and M48 Patton series of tanks that equipped American armored forces through the early Cold War. The basic design philosophy, heavy armor, powerful gun, mobility sacrificed for protection, influenced American tank design for decades. But in the context of World War II, the Pershing remains a tragic what-if. It was the best tank killer the United States produced during the war. In every measurable combat metric, firepower, protection, crew confidence, it was superior to the Sherman for fighting other tanks. But it arrived too late and in too few numbers to change anything. Overall effectiveness, 8 out of 10. An excellent tank killer that arrived too late to matter strategically. The Champion Part 1. M4 Sherman, the Flawed Colossus. The M4 Sherman is the most iconic American tank of World War II. It was not the most powerful, not the most heavily armored, not the fastest, but it was the tank that won the war. Over 49,000 were built, more than half of all American tank production. To understand the Sherman is to understand how America fought and won a global industrial war. The Sherman's development began in 1941 as a response to the critical flaws of the M3 Lee. The Lee had proven that mounting a 75mm gun in a hull sponson was a terrible idea. What was needed was a fully traversing turret that could engage targets in any direction without turning the entire vehicle. The Sherman solved this problem by placing the 75mm gun in a 360-degree rotating turret. But the Sherman's design philosophy went deeper than just fixing the Lee's problems. It was conceived from the start as a mass production vehicle. The design was standardized so that multiple manufacturers could build it simultaneously using different production methods. Chrysler could build it with a welded hull at the Detroit Arsenal. Fisher Body Division of General Motors could build it with a cast hull. Pressed Steel Car Company could build it with their own techniques. As long as the final product met the specifications, the method didn't matter. This standardization extended to components. Engines, transmissions, and suspensions were designed to be interchangeable across variants. This meant that field maintenance was simplified. A mechanic trained on one Sherman variant could work on any other. It also meant that the massive American logistics system could stock fewer different types of spare parts, while still supporting the entire fleet. The core design philosophy was balance. The Sherman was intended to be a medium tank in every sense. Not the best armor, but adequate. Not the biggest gun, but good enough. Not the fastest, but mobile enough. Not invulnerable, but repairable. The goal was a tank that was good at everything without being exceptional at anything, a jack of all trades that could handle whatever mission was assigned. Critically, the Sherman was not designed to be primarily a tank destroyer. American doctrine, influenced by pre-war theorists, assigned anti-tank warfare to dedicated tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine and M36 Jackson. These were lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns and high speed, designed to respond quickly to enemy armor threats. The Sherman's job was to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain offensive momentum. Engaging enemy tanks was supposed to be a secondary role. This doctrinal assumption would prove problematic in combat, but it explains many of the Sherman's design choices. It wasn't optimized for tank versus tank combat because it wasn't supposed to be fighting tanks as its primary mission. The M4 Sherman was not a single vehicle. It was a family of variants that evolved throughout the war as combat experience revealed necessary improvements. The initial production models were the M4 and M4 Aoni. The M4 had a welded hull constructed from rolled armor plate. The M4 Aoni had a distinctive cast hull, which was easier to manufacture in some facilities but slightly heavier. Both were armed with the 75mm M3 gun. As production ramped up, different variants emerged based on engine availability. The M4 A2 used a General Motors diesel engine. The M4 A3 used a Ford GAA Vate gasoline engine, which became the most common and reliable power plant. The M4 A4 used a Chrysler multibank engine, essentially 5 automobile engines linked together. By mid-1944, combat experience in Normandy made it clear that the 75mm gun was inadequate against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. The solution was to upgun the Sherman with the 76mm Mohn gun, a higher velocity weapon with significantly better armor penetration. Shermans with this gun were designated with a 76W suffix, the W indicating wet storage for ammunition. The 76mm gun was a major improvement. It could penetrate the Panther's frontal hull armor at close to medium range and the turret at most combat ranges. Against the Tiger I, it was effective from the front at closer ranges. However, the 76mm gun had a trade-off. Its high explosive shell was less effective than the 75mm, making it somewhat less useful for infantry support. The Easy 8. Officially, the M4 A38 appeared late in the war and is considered by many to be the best Sherman variant. The 8 designation referred to Experimental Suspension System Number 8, the Horizontal Volute Spring Suspension, or HVSS, which replaced the original Vertical Volute Spring Suspension. The HVSS made a dramatic difference. It used wider tracks and better shock absorption, which provided a smoother ride, better cross-country performance, and reduced ground pressure. The Easy 8 could traverse terrain that bogged down earlier Shermans. The combination of the 76mm gun and HVSS made it highly mobile and reasonably well armed. The Jumbo, the M4 A3E2, was a specialized assault tank produced in small numbers. It featured massively increased armor up to 178mm on the front, achieved by welding thick plates onto the standard Sherman hull. This made it nearly impervious to most German anti-tank guns. The trade-off was weight and speed. The Jumbo was slow but could lead an armored column through heavily defended areas, absorbing fire that would destroy standard Shermans. The British made perhaps the most important Sherman modification. They took the standard Sherman chassis and fitted it with their 17-pounder anti-tank gun, creating the Sherman Firefly. The 17-pounder was one of the best anti-tank guns of the war, capable of penetrating the Panther's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards and the Tigers at similar distances. The Firefly gave British armored units a tank that could reliably kill German heavy armor. The Germans learned to identify and prioritize Fireflies because they were so dangerous. Standard specifications for the most common late-war variant, the M4A3, with the 76mm gun. Main armament was the 76mm Monet Aone gun. Secondary armament included a 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun on the turret roof, a 30 caliber coaxial machine gun, and a bow-mounted 30 caliber machine gun. Armor thickness ranged from 38mm on the hull sides to 108mm on the gun mantlet. The hull front was 64mm at a 47-degree slope, giving effective thickness of about 90mm. The Ford GAA Vate gasoline engine produced 450 horsepower. With a combat weight of 33 tons, this gave a power-to-weight ratio of about 14 horsepower per ton. Top speed was 25 to 30 miles per hour, with a maximum road range of about 120 miles. Crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Now let's break down effectiveness. Firepower. This is the most controversial category for the Sherman. The answer depends entirely on when you're asking and what it's fighting. The original 75mm gun was excellent in 1942 and 43. It could penetrate the frontal armor of the Panzer III and early Panzer IV models at standard combat ranges. Its high-explosive shell was outstanding for infantry support. By June 1944, when American forces encountered Panthers in Normandy, the 75mm was obsolete for anti-tank work. The Panther's frontal armor could not be penetrated at any practical combat range. The 76mm gun improved the situation significantly. It could penetrate the Panther's frontal hull armor at ranges of 500 to 800 yards, depending on ammunition type. Against the Tiger I's flat armor, it was effective at ranges up to 1,000 yards. High-velocity armor-piercing rounds tungsten core penetrators dramatically improved performance, but these were always in critically short supply. Compared to the Panzer IV, the late-model Sherman with the 76mm was superior. Against Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman was outmatched, but those were heavier tank classes. Mobility. The Sherman excelled here. With a good power-to-weight ratio and reliable engine, it was quick and agile. The HVSS on Easy 8 models transformed cross-country performance. Compared to German heavy tanks, the Sherman was far more mobile. Panthers were faster on paper, but mechanically unreliable. Tigers were slow and cumbersome. The Sherman's reliability meant it was almost always available and operational. Protection. This was the Sherman's weakest category. The frontal armor was adequate for early war, but quickly became insufficient. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The side armor was only 38mm and vertical, making it extremely vulnerable. The tall profile 9 feet high made the tank easier to spot and hit. The most infamous problem was the fire hazard. Early Shermans stored ammunition in sponsons where it was vulnerable to hits. When penetrated, the ammunition would explode and burn, often killing the crew. This earned nicknames like Ronson and Tommy Cooker. The solution came with wet storage ammunition racks, introduced in early 1944. The ammunition was relocated to the floor and surrounded by jackets filled with water and glycol. This reduced fire rates after penetration from 60 to 80% down to 10 to 15%. This modification saved thousands of lives, though the earlier reputation stuck. Logistics and reliability. This is where the Sherman achieved excellence. It was extraordinarily reliable. The Ford GAA engine was nearly bulletproof. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Field maintenance was straightforward. The American recovery system, built around M32 tank recovery vehicles, meant disabled Shermans could be back in service within 24 hours. Operational readiness rates were typically 80 to 90% for American units. German Panther units were often at 50% or lower. This meant more Shermans were always available to fight, which was a decisive strategic advantage. Strategic availability: 49,234 Shermans produced. This number meant Shermans equipped every American armored division and were present at every major campaign: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, and across the Pacific. Thousands went to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. This ubiquity was strategic power. The Sherman was also incredibly versatile. The basic chassis was adapted to dozens of specialized roles: DD swimming tanks for D-Day, flamethrower tanks for bunkers, dozer tanks for obstacles, the 34 Calliope rocket launcher, and M32 recovery vehicles. This adaptability meant the Sherman platform could fulfill missions far beyond its original design. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a platform, a system, and a symbol of American industrial power. It wasn't designed to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be good enough in every role, reliable enough to keep fighting, and producible enough to be everywhere at once. By those measures, it succeeded spectacularly.